Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, my name is Sandy Quinn. I'm president of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and I want to welcome you here this evening and thank you for coming. You're in for a real treat because we have one of the most distinguished and popular political and public affairs commentators in Southern California, indeed the nation, here. So please welcome our speaker, Bruce Herschenson. He was escorted and accompanied by young Anthony Curtis over there. Wave, Anthony. Anthony's the Executive Vice President of the Richard Nixon Foundation and my faithful colleague of 6 years here. I want to take a moment before we start to welcome a group of students, political science and government students from Irvine Valley College. Thank you for coming. Please stand. It's great to see young people at events like this, and it's a tribute to Bruce that they show up in numbers. So thank you. I hope you'll be here frequently. I want to tell you about a couple of upcoming events. One of them is this Monday, which is President's Day, February 21st, and we have free admission all day. That's usually what people like. But in addition to that, we have literally a Mount Rushmore of presidents. We have President Lincoln, President Jefferson, we have President Roosevelt, we have President Washington. They'll all be here. Now, it's not really the presidents. You've got to understand that. I don't want to mislead anybody. I want full transparency here. These are impersonators, but qualified they are because they're historians and they're educators. So they come here in character, in costume, and they talk about their life and legacy. It's great for kids and grandchildren, so bring yours and come yourselves, bring your camera, and at 2 o'clock right here on this big stage, we'll have them talk about their times as wartime presidents, which they, like President Nixon, all shared a responsibility for during their administrations. On March 9th, we have the distinguished two-time Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld with his new bestseller, Known and Unknowns. He'll be here speaking from this podium, and for one ticket you get not only an autographed first edition book, but you're here in this magnificent East Room to hear him engage with popular Salem Broadcasting KRLA talk show host Hugh Hewitt, where they will discuss his book. So tickets are on sale in the gift shop tonight, so you can buy them there or you can buy them online, and I hope you will. On April 1, we are celebrating the Cambodian New Year with an exciting and delightful program here in the East Room at 7 o'clock at night, where you will hear the former ambassador to the UN speak. You will hear and appreciate and watch their native dance performances. It'll be a fun evening, a great evening, and in celebration of a great event. So I hope you'll come to that too. Now, earlier in the day, on April 1, we will have popular commentator, Fox News personality, author, best-selling author Dick Morris, who today agreed to be here for his new book, which is yet to be published, March 1, and he's had a whole series of New York Times bestsellers, as this will be. It's entitled Revolt, and he'll be here to talk about it, one of his very first appearances on April 1. Watch our website for tickets on that. It'll be 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I hope you'll be here for that. How many of you are members of our Associates Club or President's Council? Oh, this is so disappointing. I mean, Bruce, I'm embarrassed. Shame on you. Really? Well, I know you're all going to correct that tonight, because you will, as you exit, go to the desk where our young lady will give you one of these brochures, and you can fill it out and you can join. It's from $50 to $5,000. You hear about events first. You get incredible discounts not only on events but in our gift store, and you get discounts on books of the authors who come here, and you get free admission. Tonight, and tonight only, for the $100 family membership, we will give you one of Secretary Rumsfeld's autographed books, and you will get an admission ticket to his event on March 9th. So I hope you will take advantage of that lavish offer. Much too generous, if you ask me, but we're doing it tonight and tonight only, so please sign up. I know you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear your good friend Bruce Herschenson. Let me remind you about his incredible background, which began in the Air Force, where he served distinguishingly, and then he formed his own motion picture company, where he produced an incredible movie called JFK, Years of Lightning, Days of Drums, which was an award winner over and over and over. People still talk about it and look at it today. From there, he went to work for the USIA. He did that for the USIA, and he won more awards as head of motion pictures and television for the United States Information Agency for them than any of the federal agencies of our government combined, including an Oscar. And for that incredible movie on JFK, he not only wrote it, he directed it, and he composed the music. Multi-talented. He was named one of the 10 most outstanding young men for the federal government. He rose to become assistant to President Nixon and served him long and well. He's visited 90 countries, incredibly qualified to speak tonight about the dilemma in Egypt and the Middle East. You know him as a KABC commentator. He was part of the 1980 transition team for the Reagan administration. He's taught at a number of universities, including Harvard, and he's now the senior fellow at the School of Public Policy and Government for Pepperdine University. These are all incredible notes in his biography and his background, but most impressive, I feel, is that he started it all. He got his rudder, his compass in life, as a box boy at Ralph's grocery store. Ladies and gentlemen, a good friend of the Nixon family, of the Nixon Foundation, of me, and of the life and legacy of President Nixon, Bruce Herschenson.
There you go. Thanks. Thanks so much. And I'm glad that Sandy mentioned Ralph's. I was at a recent meeting in Orange County of a number of people, and we were at one of those squared tables that's hollow in the middle, and everyone's sitting around the rim of it. And I'm next to a very good friend of mine, and he says, you know, you have a lot in common with that guy. And he points directly forward of me, sitting on the opposite side. And I said, really? What is it? He said, you both worked at Ralph's. And I said, no kidding. He said, you were a box boy, weren't you? And I said, yeah, I put groceries in packages, and then I took them out to people's cars. I said, what did he do? He said, he's the CEO. So I didn't really talk much to the guy. We didn't have much in common. But when a president is gone, a president from the United States, gone out of sight, and his voice can't be heard anymore, it is very common that anyone, will ask whoever worked for him, what would he do today if he was around? What would he do in this circumstance? Well, I cannot be presumptuous and say that I know what President Nixon would do. I can only say what I believe he would do, and there is a very large distinction in saying it that way. However, I am confident that President Nixon is here tonight, and he's listening to me, and I better be right. I believe that President Nixon would have supported President Mubarak from the outset of all this, because of Mubarak's decades of friendship with the United States, his consistent and successful efforts at peace in the Mideast, and that we certainly should not take the risk of someone unknown to follow Mubarak, particularly while we're engaged in a war against radical Islamist terrorists. If during this crisis President Nixon was a former president, not a current president, not the sitting president, he would be, this I'm confident of, publicly he'd be quiet. He wouldn't say one thing opposing President Obama publicly, because he wouldn't want to interfere with the policies of the sitting president, President Obama. But privately, he would give his advice to the current president by memo. Let me now assume that during this crisis, President Nixon was and is the President of the United States, not a former one. As President, I believe that on January the 25th, which was the very beginning of all this, he would have privately phoned President Mubarak, and he surely would not have said that the United States was considering cutting the aid to Egypt's military, as our current administration announced publicly. It was public that we were considering doing that. Instead, I believe that President Nixon would have said to President Mubarak, "You have built your military into a force highly respected and trusted by Egyptians, and that is known throughout the world. What does your military need, and what can we supply them?" And he would have framed it that way because of what he already knew for many, many years about Egypt, that the military is truly the ultimate voice in Egypt. He would add, "Keep in mind that U.S. aid might give you problems among your Arab neighbors and among many others in the world, and I understand that. However, I'll work with you as to what should be public or private, just as you have worked with us overtly and covertly." And he did. I further believe that President Nixon would have thought that a possible transition may become necessary. And he would have framed it this way to President Mubarak: "Plan for every contingency. Be sure you plan for every contingency so that those leaders of your country who follow you will continue your work for peace in the Mideast, which you have done so well and at such great personal risk. That is vital. Then you will have built the future as well as the past." That's what I believe he would have said. And before the conversation was done, he would say, "Your military must do all it can to continue its tradition of restraint. Most of all, Mr. President, I want you to know that we're with you." Now, I not only believe that President Nixon would have supported President Mubarak, but I believe that his immediate predecessors would have done exactly the same. Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson had to decide very often between authoritarians who were on our side or totalitarian communist governments, Soviet proxies, who opposed us. That's just the way it was. Those were so often the choices. Those former U.S. presidents wisely chose to support those who would help us, not harm our objective to win. Even going back to World War II pre-Truman, to FDR, who, regardless of any domestic policies, was, in my opinion, a great wartime president. And he had Joseph Stalin as an ally. Well, why? Joseph Stalin? Because at the time, Hitler was the greater danger. That's why. And we won that war. And we won the Cold War. But again, now we're in a world war. This one, declared by radical Islamist terrorists, in which it should be very clear to every American that our nation's survival is at stake. Not only that, but so is the survival of civilization as we know it. The question can surely be asked, yeah, but don't we want democracy for those who demonstrated in Tahrir Square? Yes, of course we do, but don't assume that those who demonstrated in Tahrir Square will have democracy. They demanded a leader get out, but they did not say who they wanted in. Most of them probably didn't know who they wanted in. Now, of course, liberty for all the people of the world has been and remains the ultimate objective of the United States. But as in earlier decades, we're faced with the most immediate threat of a current war that we better win. If we don't do that, the ultimate objective of world liberty can never be achieved, and that is simply unfortunate realism. There are those in the world who compare last Friday's fall of Mubarak with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Boy, I sure don't. The 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall forecasted not the end of a man, but the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Friday's celebration of Mubarak's fall is much more reminiscent, so much more reminiscent of 1979's departure of the Shah of Iran, and 15 days later, Iran's welcome of the Ayatollah Khomeini. Moreover, no one should ever assume that a call for elections somewhere means the creation of democracy there. Elections should be the last step in creating a democracy, as it was in ours, not the first step. First, the foundations of democracy have to be created. A constitution with an executive, a separate legislature, a separate judiciary, freedoms that cannot be taken away by government. And once all the foundations have been established, then it's time for free, fair, and frequent elections. Frequency is important because for good or ill, it seems to be human nature that people just get sick of their leaders in very short time. Through all of this, including today, just last Saturday, the Muslim Brotherhood stated that they don't want to enter the election. And many disregard the Muslim Brotherhood. But please, when they state they don't want to run an election, at one time or another, practically every aspirant for the presidency of the United States has said something very much like that. It doesn't mean anything. And today, the Muslim Brotherhood announced that they are going to form a political party. It's also said that the Muslim Brotherhood should be disregarded as a threat because it has support from only 20 to maybe 30% of the people, that's all. So how can they possibly win an election? Well, this is how. If there are multiple political parties and no runoff between the two top parties, it could mean an easy victory by having a plurality, not a majority. In 1970, the Marxist Salvador Allende won the presidency of Chile with a 36% plurality of the vote. He won over just two other candidates. And even if there is a runoff in Egypt, with or without the Muslim Brotherhood, there could be a coalition formed to oppose any supporter of U.S. policy, if there is one. And nothing is certain. I have no concrete evidence on this, but it's hard to believe that the demonstrations came only from some spontaneous quest for democracy after 6,000 years of non-democracy. At the outset, demonstrators continually talked to interviewers about low wages, about rising prices, about increasing unemployment. In other words, the same complaints of the demonstrators in Europe, in a number of countries of Europe. But those countries of Europe are democracies. I believe that even if Egypt was a democracy and the economy was as bad as it is currently, they would likely have had the demonstrations that they staged. As it happened, I'm sure that they were joined by those who truly did want a democracy, inspired by events in Tunisia that they saw on their laptops. And all this was viewed by the Muslim Brotherhood and very carefully took advantage of the circumstances, not admitting their involvement until time had passed. Now, as protests break out in other Mideast countries, who should we defend and who should we oppose? It is not complicated. We should be a friend to a friend and a foe to a foe. It simply is not complicated. The complications come, I believe, from the White House. So much that I'm not so sure that our friends and foes even believe that we still have that philosophy. After seeing how we treated Mubarak, will Bahrain's King Hamad fold up and leave with the demonstrations that are facing him? Uniquely, in Bahrain, women are allowed to vote there. The parliament is secular. And most important of all, it is the home of our Fifth Fleet at a very, very urgent time. Should we tell them to pack up? Back the demonstrators? How about Yemen, where President Saleh is fighting against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? That may well be the new headquarters of Al-Qaeda. How about King Abdullah in Jordan, King Hassan in Morocco? Do we tell them, pack up, find a place to seek refuge? As for our obvious foes, Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei and President Ahmadinejad and another foe, Syria, with President Assad, they are so repressive that they may be the ones that'll stay in power, just out of absolute brutal force. What kind of a Mideast would that be if those things happened collectively? I ended that earlier chronology of presidents that I began with Truman. I said Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, without going forward far enough to include President Carter. And I want to move to him right now. President Carter did not support friends. He abandoned them. His foreign policy offers us, in our generations at this time, a tremendous advantage by simply looking back at what he did and what it brought about. Tremendous advantage, because it was done by a president. Shortly after becoming president, Jimmy Carter advocated a human rights campaign, and boy, it sounded good. Everyone was thinking that, certainly I was, that he'd point to Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union, Fidel Castro of Cuba, Deng Xiaoping of the People's Republic of China. Those leaders opposed us. But that isn't at all what he had in mind. He moved against our friends, Humberto Romero of El Salvador, Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua, and the Shah of Iran. Those who supported us against Soviet expansion. And this was during the Cold War, the heart of it. Here's what happened. Humberto Romero was president of El Salvador, and the National Guard was accused of killing 40 demonstrators. I have no idea whether they did or they didn't. Let me assume they did. President Carter cut off all aid to El Salvador. First time in U.S. history. Never before happened to that. It was a very tight alliance. All aid stopped to that ally. With us out of the picture, communist guerrillas started a war to take over El Salvador. Next door, in Nicaragua, President Carter demanded that Anastasio Somoza leave the presidency because of charges of human rights violations. President Carter disregarded, apparently, something that I would assume he would have known. Back in 1961, Somoza had offered President Kennedy Nicaragua as a base for our invasion of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and Kennedy used it. Castro later warned that he would get revenge on Somoza for helping President Kennedy. Later, Somoza was the only leader in Latin America to offer President Johnson and President Nixon his nation's troops to fight beside our troops in Vietnam. Although neither president called on him to do it, both Presidents Johnson and Nixon were tremendously appreciative. Not President Carter, who abandoned Somoza, favoring the Sandinistas, who were proxies of the Soviet Union, and they came in full force. Somoza left office, fleeing to Miami. President Carter denied him refuge in Miami or anywhere in the United States. Somoza then went to Paraguay, where he was assassinated. He's buried in Miami, his funeral having been attended by masses of anti-Castro refugees. At the end, left behind by President Carter's abandonment of El Salvador and Nicaragua, was a Central American war that eventually cost 70,000 lives of Central Americans who fought the Soviet proxies. Third, the Shah of Iran. President Carter told the Shah to release all political prisoners. It was done. President Carter then sent General Heiser to tell Iran's generals not to support the Shah. Back home, the major media joined the crusade against the Shah. There were segments against him on CBS's 60 Minutes, and the same anti-Shah message in an ABC special called The Politics of Torture. After the Ayatollah Khomeini unsurprisingly took over Iran, President Carter's U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Andrew Young, said that someday the Ayatollah Khomeini will be known as a saint. The Shah and his family had left Iran for Morocco. They were asked to leave. Then the same thing in the Bahamas, then Mexico, then the United States, then Panama. Finally, he and his family accepted an invitation from President Anwar Sadat to come and stay in Egypt. President Sadat gave him and his family a reception in Cairo that would be fitting for any chief of state, and that's where the Shah died. President Sadat knew that what he was doing would further endanger his own life by exhibiting such friendship to the Shah and his family. Sadat already had enough domestic opposition by his countrymen and fury from other Arab states by signing a peace treaty with Israel and giving Israel diplomatic relations unlike any other government at the time. 15 years later, Jordan did, but at the time he was the only one. Sadat was assassinated by those in a troop truck that had been infiltrated by members of the Muslim Brotherhood. On October the 9th of 1981, it was the night before the entombment of President Sadat, a number of U.S. delegates to the entombment were sitting in a room to the side of the lobby of the El Aram Hotel. They were telling stories to one another about the late President Sadat. One of the most prominent diplomats there told the others in the room that he was in Cairo shortly after the Shah's arrival there, and this diplomat reminded the others of how the Shah had been forced to leave one country after another, and that only Anwar Sadat of Egypt would accept the Shah invited him. And that diplomat said that he, the diplomat, said to President Sadat at that time, and I'm quoting with very little, if any, paraphrasing, this is what the diplomat said that night. He said, "I asked President Sadat, tell me, Mr. President, it must have been a very difficult decision for you to invite the Shah, knowing that it might cause some real repercussions." President Sadat was indignant at the suggestion, and he answered by saying, "Difficult? Why should it be difficult to decide how to treat a friend? For me, there was no difficulty." President Sadat's clear answer could have been expected because he was not a neutral. It was the diplomat's muddy question that exposed his own lack of principle. Hosni Mubarak was President Sadat's vice president. Mubarak retained the peace treaty with Israel, supported President George W. Bush's actions in Iraq, and Mubarak gave the new post-Saddam government of Iraq diplomatic recognition. I believe that our current president, President Obama, either doesn't know the Carter history, or worse yet, that he does know it. I believe President Obama considers foreign policy to be a nuisance. He seems to be absorbed in his domestic agenda to the point of being irritated when international events captivate the nation's attention. In this crisis in Egypt, I believe he did not exert leadership, he exerted followership. But foreign policy is the stuff of presidents. As President George W. Bush would say, presidents are the deciders. Whereas the Congress has final jurisdiction over domestic affairs, presidents have final jurisdiction over foreign affairs. Bill Clinton couldn't get a lot of his domestic agenda through the Congress, but when he wanted to go into Bosnia, and Kosovo, and Haiti, he just did it. Good for him. George W. Bush couldn't get Congress to pass his Social Security reform, but when he wanted to go into Afghanistan and Iraq, he did it. Good. And when Obama wanted to give deadlines for both Iraq and Afghanistan, he just did it. When I said foreign policy is the stuff of presidents, I plagiarized that line from something that happened in April of 1961 after President Kennedy had ordered that covert invasion of Cuba in the Bay of Pigs. In view of the invasion's terrible conclusion, he asked former Vice President Nixon to come to the Oval Office to discuss foreign policy, having known firsthand Nixon's expertise in foreign affairs. The former Vice President was sitting on a lounge chair in the Oval Office while President Kennedy was pacing. They discussed the world conflicts of the time: Cuba, Berlin, the Congo, Egypt under Nasser, Laos, South Vietnam, the tensions between Indonesia and the UN, and between Pakistan and India, and it just went on and on. After a long discussion going around the world in their dialogue, President Kennedy stopped pacing and he said to Vice President Nixon, "This is the stuff of presidents, isn't it?" And he added, "I mean, who cares if the minimum wage is $1.15 or $1.25? Former Vice President Nixon smiled and nodded. And it wasn't that they didn't really care. It was the knowledge that domestic policy is under the final jurisdiction of the Congress, while foreign policy decisions are made by the President. This should serve as a guide for us in the elections of 2012, 2016, 2020, and beyond. The President-to-be will have final jurisdiction over foreign affairs, and every 2 years, the members of the Congress-to-be will have final jurisdiction over domestic affairs. Admittedly, both have influence on the other's domain, but they don't have final authority. In a global view, what is becoming terrible for the United States is that after the current president serves his time in office, a new president may find that it doesn't seem to make much difference to people in governments of the world what the United States thinks or says or does. Since by that time, to most of the world, our nation may be less important than other nations. They may not care what we think. For decades past, when any crisis loomed, the question worldwide has been, what will the United States do about it? After all, our nation had freed so many millions of people throughout the world. I think we all know what the world would be like if we didn't enter World War II and the Cold War. And we don't want to imagine what would happen if we don't retain that ability, that power, and that will. But better to imagine it, much better to imagine it, rather than to have the next generation live it. Because we are in a war for our survival, our immediate objective must be victory. And while we strive to do that, every international incident must be evaluated by that criterion. Too bad, but those are our times. What would President Nixon do now that President Mubarak is out? I can condense it into one sentence. He'd try to influence Egypt's military to ensure that the Muslim Brotherhood or other radicals do not come into Egypt's government, and that we make known throughout the world that we'll support our friends and oppose our foes. In the inaugural words of John Kennedy, which President Nixon would want me to quote, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we will pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty." I hope that never again is the word change used as a slogan in a political campaign. Not if it means change from the wisdom that the best of our leaders have provided for us and provided for the world. I know that those views are not supported in today's White House by some on Capitol Hill, within the foreign policy bureaucracies of D.C., and by much of the media. But I'm convinced that their views do not put into priority the risk of a friendly foreign government changing to one that could take the side of our foes while we're at war. To me, it is unthinkable to take that risk, because there's nothing, no other thing more important than the permanence of the United States. I invite your questions or statements. Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, he's agreed to a few questions, and I will ask you, if you have one, to raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic, as you can watch me do in this demonstration. I will hand it to the gentleman with the question. I will ask him to stand, and then I will hand him the mic, and he will ask the question.
Thank you for your presentation. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Because of, as you've told us tonight about your experience with Kennedy in that film, what have you, hypothetically, another hypothetical.
I'm sorry?
Another hypothetical.
Okay.
If Nixon would have been elected in 1960 rather than Kennedy, would there have been a Bay of Pigs? Would there have been a Cuban Missile Crisis? And would there be a Vietnam?
It's a great question that I can't answer, and I wouldn't even want to answer if I thought I could, because I don't want to do a disservice to any former president before Nixon. I have to add, let me just say this. When President Nixon resigned, I said, I was trying to convince him not to resign. And I said, if the nation just knew that there were tapes in the Johnson administration, in the Kennedy administration, we know even of one of the kind of wax recordings that were made in the Roosevelt administration. I said, but no one's saying anything. None of the Kennedy people or Johnson people are saying anything. I said, and both of them had already passed away, both Kennedy and Johnson. And I said, if the American people knew that, they're very fair, and I think they would put all of this in a different perspective, because the tapes were the big deal at the time. And he looked at me and he said, never defend me by putting down a former president. He said, Mrs. Johnson is still alive, and she's doing pretty well, and she's a lovely woman. That was, I remember the word lovely because that was part of his vocabulary and it wasn't mine. She's a lovely woman, and I wouldn't want any distress to her. So I'm very careful. I never say anything about a former president, but I didn't promise to say anything about a following president. And so I feel very free to say what I just did about Carter, but I don't want to do that because frankly, I don't know. And secondly, I don't know if I want to use my imagination that way.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a hypothetical question about the future. Given that President Obama seems to be, at least in spirit, very much like President Carter, what do you foresee actually taking place? I know you've talked about what would Nixon do, what would President Nixon do, but assuming that President Obama doesn't do what President Nixon would do you see war with Israel? What do you see on the horizon?
First, as I do feel that he thinks of foreign policy as a nuisance. I could tell every time that he talked about foreign policy, when I watched him on television, there wasn't that passion that he has when he talks about other things. It's almost matter of fact. I remember seeing him when he was in Hawaii. He was talking about that incident that happened 2 Christmases ago with the guy who was caught in Detroit. And he had on a sports shirt, and he was reading text. And it's okay if he read text, but I could tell he didn't even write it, because he didn't have any passion. And that is not necessarily something that you generally find in President Obama. He has great passion when he talks about the health care, or he talks about anything in domestic. And I'm very concerned about what will now happen. I don't think he would give I don't know if he knows that history of President Carter or not. But it is an example for any future president. What if I were to abandon friends? Well, it's been done. It's been tried. I didn't even mention, because it just didn't seem to fit in with what I was saying, but his abandonment of Taiwan. Just so you know, and I'm sorry to give you a long answer on a very, very good question, but he didn't. Let me just tell you this. When President Carter was in office, he had briefings from former presidents. One of them was his knowledge that President Nixon went to China, talked to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and they said that they wanted to have diplomatic relations with the United States. And they said, but there are 3 conditions for that. One is that you get your troops out of Taiwan. Secondly, you break relations with Taiwan. And third, that you abrogate the mutual defense treaty that you've had with Taiwan since 1954. President Nixon took less than a second to say no. He then told President Ford, when President Ford became president, what had happened. He briefed him, and he told President Ford that he knows that he's going to be talking to these guys, and he wanted him to know what they were going to offer him and what President Nixon said. They did indeed offer him diplomatic relations with those 3 caveats. It took, from what I understand, it took President Ford less than a second to say no. He already knew what President Nixon done. President Nixon told President Carter, to my knowledge, President Ford told him too. I'm not confirmed on that. And President Carter was given the same offer, and he said yes. That's all. It's that simple. Big decision, such big pieces of history occur because one guy said, yeah, I'll do that. So on December the 15th of '78, President Carter gives a speech to the United States while Congress is on vacation, Christmas vacation, and says what he did. I think I'm not going to go into the whole history. He was taken to court on it and all of that, but it didn't do anything. And that's the way it is. President Nixon publicly was supportive of what President Carter did. Privately, he was, to say angry is putting it mildly. He wrote a long letter to President Carter telling him what he thought, but it was private. But now time has passed, and those things should be known, not just because it was President Nixon, but because we're going through something in history of someone who doesn't feel that strongly about allies. And you got to when you're president, if you're in a war.
Bruce, a young man from Irvine Valley College.
I'm Trevor Weinberg, and I'm 18 years old. And first of all, excellent speech. And the thing I enjoyed the most was about Carter.
Yes.
And I would like to know, for the allies of America, how much stock we should put into the human rights violations that many of our allies have committed. And
a lot. You have to. You can't just totally ignore it. Okay. But you always have to balance it with what the alternative will be. You have to. Generally, it's someone who may be extreme on one end who's going to be replaced by someone who's an extreme on the other end, and if you're in between, you'll be shot. Because in some countries of the world, that's the way it is. And I believe, out of just seeing it, with all of those former presidents, from Truman through Nixon, of having that philosophy of being a friend to a friend and a foe to a foe, even if some of your friends do things that you believe are terrible. But they don't bother, they're not expansionist as totalitarians are, they're authoritarians. They don't disallow their own citizens to leave their borders. They permit emigration. And, more than anything else, they are not expansionists, but totalitarians are. But seeing that entire history of that period and knowing that it worked, look at the progress that democracy has made exactly that way. When President, let me just let me move this backwards and then forwards. When President Kennedy was in office, most of the European powers were decolonializing. They were taking their colonies out of the African continent. There were celebrations. I mean, there are 52 countries, and it's in Africa, and it seemed like this is going to be a democracy for all of them, because they all said they're going to have free and fair elections. They did. Not frequent. That's where when we started saying one man, one vote, one time. Okay. By the time Nixon got into office, out of the 52 countries, there were exactly 4 democracies. All of the rest were non-democracies. Presidents for life, monarchies, all kinds of things. But there were 4, and there were, I hope I remember, because they were very small countries. They weren't predominant. It wasn't Nigeria. It wasn't Egypt. It wasn't any. It was Botswana, Mauritius, Senegal, and Gambia. That's it. In Latin America, there were 35 countries. There were 3 democracies: Venezuela, Colombia, and Costa Rica. By the time that, during the Reagan administration, out of the 35 countries, there were 34 that were democracies. Only Cuba was not. I realize it's teetered back and forth. Haiti was a question mark at that time. In Africa, 17 countries were democracies. It was moving. In the United Nations in the Kennedy days, something like there were 22 democracies. Now it's about half of the UN that are democracies. It's got 193 countries. It's 192 countries now. But anyway, it worked. It takes time, and you cannot take your eye off the objective of the moment. And the objective of the moment is to make sure that you win the war that you're in. And that's the way that you do it. Can you imagine what the Mideast would look like if these things happen? If Bahrain becomes a foe rather than a friend and the Fifth Fleet is there? If any number of, there's so many of them now that are facing demonstrations. If those people are forced, those leaders are forced to leave and foes come in, what are we going to have? I mean, then it'll be every country in the Mideast outside of Israel against us. And I mean, that's, I think they did it right, and I think Carter did it wrong. I didn't put it this way, but out of 40 people being killed, and he stopped all aid, 70,000 were killed in the end in a war. Yeah, you pay attention to it, but you have to realize what you're dealing with at the time.
Bruce, another one from our youthful audience, this time from a USC alum, Patrick McFarland.
Thanks, Sandy. Thank you for putting on this presentation. We really appreciate it. The question I have is how you foresee the events impacting both the United States and the world economically, especially with a specific regard for the Suez Canal.
I'm sorry, on economics, did you say?
Correct.
Yeah, terrible. I mean, I try to look through everything as a, through foreign policy and foreign security, and I realize that in terms of economics, we simply don't have the power that we had. And I now hear both Democrats and Republicans saying, because we have to cut everywhere, we have to cut defense. That, to me, is asking for defeats that we don't need to have. Defense is different than anything else in the budget in this way. First, it's constitutional. The government has to provide the common defense. Provide. Not promote, like the general welfare, but provide it. Okay, constitutional. Aside from that, there is no way, as someone here before was mentioning about contingency, about those things that might happen in the future, there's no way to predict with accuracy what we're going to need before we need it. You write contingencies, you do everything you can to imagine everything possible, everything impossible that can happen and what we might do about it. You do all of that. But, you know, just suddenly some planes hit the World Trade Center and Somerset County in Pennsylvania and the Pentagon. And suddenly things happen. With Social Security, we know how much it's going to cost in coming years because we can project it based on population, on mortality rates, on all kinds of things. Department of, excuse me, I'm thinking ahead. Department of Transportation would be how many interstate highways we have, what kind of maintenance they need. You can pretty well gather those things and projections for the future. Housing and urban development, all of those silly cabinet offices that we have. But the Department of Defense cannot say with precision what they're going to need the next hour from now. And that's what, you're always going to get a defense budget that is either too high or too low, because you can't hit it right on the nose. You just can't. If it's too high, we're going to waste a lot of money. If it's too low, we're going to waste the United States. I'll take my chances on betting too high. And so when I understand that we got to cut, we got to cut things out. Well, good Lord! I'll say this while there's a number of students here: cut out the Department of Education. By that single, education was, I deal with students all the time, naturally, at Pepperdine. But Education, public education, was terrific when I was a kid. The federal government had zero to do with it. Zero. California was considered the best public schools in the nation, because they were. The thought of my folks sending me to a private school, I don't think it ever entered their mind. It sure didn't enter mine. I'm sure it didn't enter theirs. Why? The schools were terrific. They're not now. We are somewhere, we're either 47th or 48th right now in education in the United States. But none of the states are great. But that was before the Department of Education ever had a hand in anything. Dump it. Go back to when it worked. When you see any history, when you see things that were successful and things that were failures, gravitate towards the success. And why do we have a housing and urban development? I mean, come on. Why would we even have a Department of Commerce? I mean, I know exactly what I believe should be done economically. And and never again should we call anything an entitlement. The only thing that you are entitled to is to be free. That's it. And the government will take care of security.
Bruce? Bruce,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Are you ready for that?
Please, of course.
All right, the gentleman in the second row here.
Mr. Herschenson, it's, by the way, been a privilege. I, years ago, worked on your campaign for Senate. I wish you could
Thank you very much.
The question, you kind of already touched on it, but is there a history?
Well, are you the one that ruined the campaign?
No, sir.
I lost, you know.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Much to my disappointment. You touched a little bit on the topic I wanted to ask you about.
On what?
You already touched on the topic that I was going to ask you about, and that is there a historical precedent any time in the past, because we're here looking back as well, where we cut the Department of Defense and ignored foreign policy? Is there a historical precedent for everything?
Yeah, there sure is a precedent for that.
What are the lessons we learned?
Yeah, there was a precedent in George H.W. Bush's administration when the Congress said that we have a peace dividend. The Cold War's over and we don't need it all. He fought that for a while and finally went along with the gag. And we had a peace dividend, and we drastically cut the Department of Defense. And of course, 9/11 came, and we had a drastically reduced Department of Defense. So we do have a historical precedence of really cutting it drastically. Also, again, during the Carter administration, he and the Congress cut funds quite dramatically, particularly the Navy, surprisingly, because he was with the Navy.
Bruce, the young lady in the front row here.
Thank you so much. Is that good? Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
My question is, what should the American government be doing if one of our friends is corrupt? For example, I've been reading that a lot of the rage in Tunisia and Egypt from the young people is because they said that their leaders were corrupt. And I've been reading that Mubarak is a billionaire. And I've been reading that the United States sends billions of dollars every year to Egypt. So is it the United States policy to look the other way? Thank you.
Yes, good question, and the answer to that is no, we don't look the other way. But there's another part to this answer. Most of the world's leaders are corrupt. They were almost all corrupt before the United States always got mad at it. I mean, you could go around the world and it was just filled with, it is the way that the world operated. As far as the $1.3 billion that we give, that by and large goes to the military. I am not saying he doesn't have any of our money. Maybe he does. I don't know. Should we get out of Afghanistan because Karzai is corrupt? Of course he is. I mean, it's the way it is. Too bad, but it's the way it is. Now, I remember, and this is one thing that I can say that I disagreed with President Reagan on. We, in a sense, kidnapped President Marcos because he was corrupt. It wasn't because he wasn't a good friend. He helped us in Vietnam. He did a lot of things, but we did. We certainly gave him safe refuge, and who was he replaced by? Corazon Aquino, who was truly corrupt, and not only that, but as soon as she came into office, she refused to see our Secretary of Defense when he visited there. She canceled a national holiday that had been there since the end of World War II called Filipino-American Friendship Day. That was canceled, and closed down the two biggest bases we had outside of the United States, Clark Air Force Base and Subic Bay Naval Base. That was our thanks, and she was corrupt as the devil. So we got rid of one corrupt guy who was a friend, replaced with someone else corrupt who was an enemy. And I shouldn't say an enemy. I mean, she didn't go to war against us or anything, but boy, she sure wasn't a friend. But you gotta, look, I realize certainly the biggest example currently is Karzai. We all know he's corrupt. I mean, I have to say, so what? We're not fighting a war for Karzai. We're fighting a war to get rid of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Keep your eyes on that. That's all.
Bruce, our final question from Irvine Valley College.
Hi, I'm Kyle Adamson, and I'm age 20. And my question is, when Nixon supports Mubarak and public opinion in Egypt continues to not support Mubarak, would he take military action?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the thrust of it. Sandy, your mouth is a little close to the mic, and when it is, I can't hear real well.
Okay. My question is, if public opinion continues to not support Mubarak, would Nixon take military action?
What nation should take military action?
Would Nixon take military action?
Would Nixon take military action? No, I never said he would take military action even in the worst of times. In this case, I'm saying that we would help the military of Egypt. I believe he would have helped the military of Egypt as he helped the military of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Say, anything you need, we'll give you. And that's the way we often help a friend. And it's the way that we should continue to help friends. It is what worries me when the young lady was speaking about how we're doing economically right now. And I just want to say one thing, because I can tell with Sandy's walking over here that I'm through. That's the nice way that he does that. He looks at me and he goes, like that. I just want to say one thing. When I said be careful on 2012 and 2016 and all of that, you know what really that gets me, and I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to change this. I don't know if I ever can. Like right now, I'm looking at the lineup of Republican people who are aspirants for the president. Okay, who knows anything about foreign policy other than John Bolton? No one. They don't. I mean, that's just the way it is. Now, Mike Huckabee is doing pretty well, but I can tell, boy, he understands what a president really does. And if we don't understand that as voters, I hear people say, boy, I sure am for so-and-so. I'm not going to give the name because they're all nice people. But why? What do they know about the thing that they're going to be responsible for, which is the survival of the United States, frankly? And if you look back at those past presidents, past World War II, and you think, what is it? What is it that they're remembered for? What policy? I'm not talking about assassination or scandal or something like that. What policy are they remembered for more than any other? You could go back through them, and just with a couple exceptions, everyone. Truman, atom bomb. Ike, Korea. Kennedy, Cuban Missile Crisis. Johnson, Vietnam. Nixon, Vietnam, and China. Ford, one of those exceptions. He isn't not domestic or foreign. I mean, it just didn't work out. Carter, the Iranian hostage crisis. Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Bush 41, the liberation of Kuwait, Persian Gulf War. Clinton, again, he was the luckiest man in the world, became president. He became president after the Cold War was won and before 9/11. George Bush, let's see, where am I now? George Bush, 43, obviously, the war against Islamist terrorism, Afghanistan and Iraq. But it's the way history works out, because that is what presidents do. And I'll say one thing, I am a great supporter, a friend of the Tea Party movement. I love it, I do. But I want to... I am. Very much so. I am, however, terribly concerned. I'm concerned because all of their concentration was over economics. Nothing about foreign policy. It's okay, and I sort of let it go in my mind, because they were all running for Congress. This wasn't a presidential election that we just went through. So that's okay. But I hear them still doing it when they talk about the possibility of them running for Congress. And that bothers me, because that means they're not thinking of, they're now thinking of running for the president, but they don't know what a president does. Too bad. And I fear this, and I know there may be supporters of this guy in this room, but I fear this, that they're going to look towards one person in the Tea Party who does talk about foreign policy, and that is Rand Paul. But he wants us to get out of everywhere. You may remember the McGovern slogan in 1972. Go home, America. He's adopted it. Not in those words, but he's adopted it. Foreign aid to no one. They may look toward him because he's one of them in the Tea Party landslide of last year, and also talks about foreign policy. I don't want them to look toward him as the example, or they're going to make a terrible error. I mean, I know when someone talks about a subject that I really don't know much about or really don't care much about, and I really respect that person, I'll listen very carefully because of my respect for that person. I don't want them to do that in this case. I want them to really know their stuff. And it does concern me that I see this whole lineup of very good people who are running. But for the presidency, they better know what a president does, not learn when they get there. We are having right now a president with on-the-job training. We are. We are. Too bad, but we are. And a president who didn't care about foreign policy going in and doesn't care about it now. He's going to let it take its course. And that's why it was such an erratic behavior over these past couple of weeks. And he got his advice from who knows. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. Listen, thank you so much. I'm waiting here at the podium because I have to wait for this extremely extravagant gift that Sandy gives his speakers. It's really terrific, and I just didn't want to leave before receiving it.
Yes.
Please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who have been here before know that our speakers come not because of the lavish honorariums we give them, not for the Bank of Global Television back there to capture every word and every moment of their appearance, but for these beautifully crafted, American-made, limited edition, limited to the number we can sell in our gift shop, What Would Nixon Do mugs, appropriately titled for the topic of his talk tonight. You will not find Bruce at your local Ralph's grocery store packing your bags, but you will find him here again. Do you want him to come back? Would you come back? Well, as you know, Bruce writes books, and he's writing another one now. However, and he doesn't like me to say this, we have them in the gift shop. We have some of his books in the gift shop. If you'd like to get them, I'm sure you can catch him and he'll sign them tonight. Bruce, thank you for coming. You're always welcome. Please come back.